Good morning and a very warm welcome to the 19th India Policy Forum. My NCR colleagues and co-editors, Praveen Krishna and Karthik Muralidharan, we all of us are really pleased that you are here for this conference in person after nearly 3 years. And as many of you know, it's a two-part event really. There is a conference which will last for 2 days, and there will be a volume, a journal that will come out of it in about 7-8 months. And we generally release the previous year's edition at the conference. So we'll be doing that tonight. Now we are ready to start with our first session. Mr. Amitabh Kant was going to chair the session, but things have changed in the last few days. He is the new G20 Sherpa for India, and he's in Bali, so he could not make it. He has sent us his wishes. But we are really fortunate that Professor Nirvikar Singh agreed to step in last minute. So he'll be chairing the session. Again, thanks for being here. Over to you, Nirvikar.
So thank you, Poonam, and welcome everybody. It's really wonderful to be in person after a long gap, and I know you're disappointed that Amitabh Kant isn't here, but I'll do my best to keep time. This is really the perfect start to the conference in the sense that one of the core challenges of Indian economic development is creating good jobs. I think Manish Sabarwal wrote recently that the problem is not jobs but wages, and of course wages are higher when productivity is higher, and the essential role of firms in an economy is to organize production to make jobs more productive. So I think this is really the perfect start to today's, to the IPF, this year's IPF. We have an amazing speaker and panelists. I'll just very briefly introduce them. I'm not going to read out the whole bios, but Tarun Khanna, our speaker, is the Jorge Paulo Lehmann Professor at Harvard and the first director of the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, Harvard's university-wide endeavor on India. And he's himself obviously a very successful, very prominent researcher, successful entrepreneur and investor. And maybe the statistic that will boggle everybody's minds is that he's got an online class on entrepreneurship in emerging markets that has been taken by 750,000 students. So that is really, I think, quite remarkable. Our panelists, our discussants are Dr. Ramgopal Rao, and he's the Pillai Chair Professor at IIT Delhi, past director, winner of many prizes with 480 publications and 49 patents. So really quite a distinguished record too. And last but not least, Chintan Vaishnav is on leave from MIT and holds a very pivotal position, key position in the government as the mission director for the Atal Innovation Mission under the auspices of Niti Aayog. So this is really the perfect start to this year's IPF. And with that, I'll hand over to Professor Tarun Khanna. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Poonam, and thank you, NCAR colleagues, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I've watched this conference from afar a few times, and I'm glad to be here, and glad that it's in person. And it's nice to have a bunch of colleagues and friends who are more qualified than I on this topic. Nonetheless, I'll try to add a little bit of value. As Nirvikar said, the basis of what I'm going to talk about, well, the title is here: Science-Based Entrepreneurship in India, Policy Glass as Yet Quarter Full, by which I mean to signal that whereas we should in fact all collectively be proud at the entrepreneurial prowess that has been exhibited in India, and we've got a lot of justified self-congratulation perhaps in the media for the last few years of Startup Nation and so on and so forth. I want to take a little bit of a skeptical look at it. Being a proponent of that entire process, I want to be a skeptical academic, which I think is the role of the academic, and to say that we're only just getting started. And in particular, I am actually very concerned that most of the startups that we see, and maybe I'm perhaps both more credible and more compromised by virtue of being an entrepreneur myself and actively engaged in that process. But I don't see much attention to what I refer to as science-based entrepreneurship. I'm going to duck the question of what is the definition of science-based entrepreneurship. Everything ultimately traces back to some scientific insight. But let's leave that aside for a second. But if you think about, what are canonical things that are happening very recently in my adopted home backyards in the United States, I like to think of SpaceX, or I like to think of Moderna and mRNA and the vaccines and so on. That, to my mind, qualifies as science-based entrepreneurship in some ways. And just to fixate on those two examples, since they are in my mind as I say these words, they are 90, 95, 98% funded by the federal government. And I think we should just pause with that statistic and say that unless we have dramatic investment in science, which we don't in this country, it's a source of deep concern for me. And unless we have the translational mechanisms, which is the focus of the policy aspect of my talk, unless we actively cultivate those translational mechanisms so that science and would-be entrepreneurs can speak to each other and the ideas can be brought to fruition, I think we are shortchanging ourselves as a country. And since the mind is focused by comparison, I would submit that if you take a look at the careful statistics, and there are lots of very careful analyses published, particularly in science, in the past few years by some of my colleagues at Harvard and MIT and Berkeley in particular, you'll see that the gap between the US and India and the gap between China and India on what I would define as science-based entrepreneurship is widening, and arguably widening at a faster and faster rate. So I think that should be a cause for concern, because it's essentially saying that we're not investing in the seed corn for what should happen not a generation from now, but maybe even 5, 7, 10 years from now. And as a practical entrepreneur, putting aside my academic hat, as a practical entrepreneur and sitting on very, very, very many investment committees, I can think of quite a few instances where we've walked away from investments, particularly in artificial intelligence, where we've decided not to do it because as an investor, there's a more than reasonable likelihood that we will be outcompeted by somebody with access to better databases and better infrastructure 3 to 5 years from now. And so it just doesn't seem like you can play on that pitch that's stacked against you in some ways. So that's the source of the concern. But I think that on the more encouraging side, I think that the recipe to get out of this is pretty well understood. Not the details, but the broad contours of what one might plausibly do. And the reason I would say the glass is not empty, but it's quarter full, is that we have run some experiments. I've been privileged to be part of some of them, and I think the quick and dirty preliminary data seem to suggest to me that that even though they are works in progress, eminently works in progress, that they are showing early signs of promise. I want to acknowledge, Chintan runs the Atal Innovation Mission. Arvind was running Niti Aayog. When I started working on what became the Atal Innovation Mission, I had the privilege of chairing a committee that resulted in the AIM sitting under Niti Aayog, and then Rajiv Kumar, who took over from Arvind, saw it through, and of course the eminent Amitabh Kant was around at Niti Aayog when that was going on as well. So I want to acknowledge the collective work of all these stalwarts. Let me start with this picture, which has nothing to do with India, but it has everything to do with science. This is an outfit that's run by a friend of mine who used to run the Google Waymo project, the autonomous car project. So he now oversees, I don't know how to describe this, it's called New Lab. Anybody can Google it, newlab.com. It's the former Brooklyn Navy Yard in city of New York, the northern part of the city of New York, Arvind's backyard in some ways. And it's been around since 1801, and goes through cycles of investment and reinvestment. But a few years ago, it was sitting empty. The last use of it was as literally a shipyard in World War II. And the then governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, since fallen from grace, thought that it was a place where something could be done. And two entrepreneurs approached him and said, look, for the right amount of right and well-structured subsidies, why don't we set up a process so that we don't keep losing entrepreneurs to Boston, particularly in the science-based areas that we're all leaving New York City. And so what's been created is essentially what I would like us to think about. Not literally this, but this is effectively a handshake mechanism between deep science and entrepreneurs. That's what this is. This is the physical embodiment of a lot of soft infrastructure that is needed for scientists who are steeped in their science as they should be, and entrepreneurs who are steeped in the process of creating, with the rough and tumble of the market, something that can then generate jobs and advance society's needs forward. I'll give you an example of what they do. I've been spending a lot of time here because A, it's exciting. I love science. I'm an applied math guy, so I'm far away from pure science, but I love science and I love reading scientific papers. And I love being here because it's full of scientists and they're mixing with entrepreneurs. It's all hardware, software, deep tech, deep immersion. I'll give you a few examples of it. So here are some examples, actually. Let me show you some that I picked out that were kind of fun. And these are all done in 3-4 years, coming straight out of labs, right? So on the top left is a venture called Launcher that can launch satellites to very precise geolocated locations in space at very low cost. So it's almost like saying, here's a Google map of Delhi. I'd like the satellite to be sitting right over here at this point, and zoop, it's right there, right? It's kind of cool. Took only 4 years to create from the lab to an actual prototype. The one on the top right is one of my favorites. It's very simple. You see that device in the front tire? It's a friction motor. And it's an engineer from Chandigarh, actually, and an engineer from Marseille in south of France who got together. And you essentially go and you clap it onto any cycle anywhere in the world. I tried it in Manhattan, right? And it becomes an electric bike instantly. Think about that, right? And it fits in this size. Right? So I'm all over it immediately. I've basically created a company around it. I'm running with it and saying this could be very cool in India, right? If you had an adapted version of this. The one on the bottom left is using ammonia to create carbon-free energy, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. But there's thousands of these, essentially, in these large warehouses. And the key is that the production function is now established so that any scientist can show up and say, I want to work on this. But here's an example of what they would do. So they would say, okay, companies in the world, come and tell us what your problems are. By the way, there's no reason we can't do this in Delhi. No reason whatsoever. It would take me less than 6 months to set it up now that I know how to do it, if somebody had the wherewithal to want to do it. But a company would come to them, so pick a company. BMW would come to them, right? Or Tata's would come to them and say, these are the problems we're interested in. They would say, okay, for a very tiny sum of money, let us go find smart people who are working on aspects of this problem. Right? And they have developed the networks and infrastructure around the world to go find, I believe it's up to 30 candidate startups that are working on this problem all over the world. They would then present it to BMW or Tata's. Tata's would shortlist and say, we like these 6 or 7. And then, this is the key, they would then prototype them in less than a year. And at the end of it, show BMW and Tata's, all for basically almost no fee. Right? This is all being done for almost no fee. All that New Lab retains is the right to invest in whatever BMW and Tata picks. So that's the business model. Right? You pay us a modest administrative fee, we do this thing for you, which is a huge information asymmetry. Right? How do you find these people all over the world? How do you curate the insights? How do you present it? It's an enormous act of creativity and a melange of ideas. You're sort of mixing different things and producing this stuff. And then we prototype them, and typically 2 or 3 of them will be picked up by the companies, and they will run with it. So the entrepreneur gets something, right? The entrepreneur who had an idea, he or she had an idea, and they brought it. They have a ready prototyping partner in the BMW and Tata's. They have the infrastructure set up. And then they will take the idea, if it's taken, and syndicate the investment to their networks so that anybody can invest in it. as long as they pay a carry to New Lab. So that's the business model of New Lab. And there's a waiting list of 800, 900 global corporations trying to get in and say, we want you to run our prototypes. Okay, so that's the idea. So what's the generalization of this is that for any idea, so here's a cartoon, right? For any idea, ideas are cheap at some level, but for it to actually come to fruition and create an organization, a company that generates incremental social surplus, it needs a lot of supporting structures. I just put 5 bubbles out there, but there's an endless list of supporting intermediation functions that need to happen. Of course, it needs risk capital, right? It needs market research of different sorts. It needs talent in different ways. Self-servingly, I put business schools on top. It's not clear that we need business schools really, but self-servingly, allow me that indulgence. We need logistics, we need auditors, all kinds of stuff we need, right? So the thing is that if you have a really deep tech scientific insight, I believe that the equivalent of these bubbles are not just conjured up. They have to be policy willed into existence. Somebody has to focus on creating the soft infrastructure that's needed, as New Lab did. And New Lab, by the way, is a commercial enterprise, a wildly successful commercial enterprise, but it would not have come into existence without Andrew Cuomo and Bill Blasio, the mayor of New York, stepping up and providing any number of concessional grants. And it would not have come into existence if it didn't rely on Arvind's institution, Columbia, very extensively, NYU, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Cornell Tech, and the whole bunch of infrastructure up and down, the state of New York and New Jersey, Princeton, and so on and so forth. So scientists from these places have a home. Entrepreneurs from around the world now have a home to come and do this kind of stuff. It's not the only place. They could do it in the Bay Area or Berlin or any number of Tel Aviv, any other number of other places, but it's a home. So really the thrust of what I want to say is very simple. It's in these 2 pictures. It's in New Lab and it's in this cartoon schematic that we need to build this supporting soft infrastructure to take whatever scientific ideas we have. And we have some unbelievable scientific insights sitting around here, right? Chintan was telling me he was just in ISRO. So ISRO is a great example. You go to ISRO, you can't but be inspired by walking around with the quality of the science there, with the minimal resources that's in there. But the prospect that these insights are going to translate into commercial enterprises like Launcher in 2 years or 3 years from identification of the idea, there's not a snowball's chance in hell currently. Or the IITs, right? Or the Indian Institute of Science. I mean, there's so many insights sitting there. And you see some of this happening. You see it in IIT Delhi, you see it in IIT Madras. But we need to do this with far greater imagination, far greater resources, 2 orders of magnitude more at least, quickly. That's my submission and hope. Slightly more carefully than this cartoon, in some of my earlier work with the finance people at Harvard and MIT, I came up with a taxonomy. I don't know if you can see it, it's in the paper. It's nearly collectively exhaustive and sort of mutually exclusive on the left to adopt that kind of language, right? But on the left are the kinds of functions that these institutions provide. I'll read them to you. Credibility enhancer, right? So an example of a credibility enhancer is an audit committee on a board, right? That by virtue of there being a well-functioning governance function and audit committee, the credibility and the veracity of the claims made by a publicly traded company, right, are enhanced for the lay investor or institutional investors outside, right? The second one is information analyzers, right? So you can think of, whether you think of the markets for talent or capital or ideas, you can think about intermediation functions that basically attest, and in a sense, New Lab is that. New Lab is basically saying, here are, 800 entrepreneurs that applied to be part of the BMW pilot. We kind of went through them because we have the scientific wherewithal and access to scientific talent to look through them and say, these 100 look better than the other 700. Right? So that's the function that New Lab is playing. Going down, there's sort of marketplaces, aggregators, transaction facilitators, and finally, I would say adjudicators, who essentially mediate disputes between different potential transacting partners. And I think a version of this has to be thought through for science-based, deep science entrepreneurship in some sense. I find this taxonomy to be, jargony a little bit. It's borrowed from basically the finance part of the economics profession for the most part. and butchered a little bit. But I find it to be very practical in some ways, and a checklist for, and this is in effect the core of what became AIM. It's sort of a guiding principle for me to say that what we create, which Chintan now runs so expertly, what we create should essentially be hitting as many of these functions as possible in order for a true market for ideas to be consummated and to come into being. Right? This is New Lab's response to these different functions. I'll leave it at that. I wanted to put up this graph here. Now, think about it. Let me just leave this up for a second and say the following. Nirvika, how much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay. Think about, so what happens when BMW or Verizon or Tata's or somebody comes and taps into all this scientific insight, right? Where does that get recognized on the company's accounting statements or balance sheets? These are all intangible assets, right? And it's a very murky area of accounting because all my academic accounting colleagues struggle with this, which is how do we account for intangible assets? The classical income statement and balance sheet are not set up to do it very well. And we always struggle with how do we do this? How does the market actually price intangible assets? What's the right way to think about the discount rate in investing for this, et cetera? That said, there are some heroic efforts to measure intangible assets. And I put up on the bottom left and bottom right, two graphics that both say that most of the investment, if you go back from the early 70s to a 50-year time period, you can see that the investment has shifted to being primarily in intangible assets now, right? Much less in physical assets. That's where the bulk of company investments are going. And if you go into what constitutes intangible assets, big picture, as we say in Hindi, mota mota, it's basically 70 to 80% of it is R&D. The rest of the 20-25% is maybe branding and things of that nature. So think of this as a rough proxy for investment in R&D is really going up. Here are some other statistics. A third of, this is from a paper that my former student published in Science recently. Think of these numbers. A third of all patents issued in the last 2 to 3 decades in the United States are entirely funded purely by the government, by the US government. Right? Third of patents. Probably another third are indirectly funded by the US government. That's a guess. The patents that are most valuable are the ones that are funded directly by federally funded research. Right? Those are the ones that are most valued by the market ultimately. There is the most likely to result in companies, so on and so forth. So these are numbers that are the result of careful accounting exercises. The graph on the right is from our friends at McKinsey, which basically also say that the investment mix has shifted very much towards intangibles from tangible. This is all the result of R&D, not just of companies embracing the startup phenomenon. Of course, they're doing their own investment in-house and so on. But the point that I was trying to make, the connection to the New Lab example and the taxonomy that I put up earlier is that if you have the wherewithal to take scientific ideas from the lab to the market, it manifests as intangible assets in some ways. And that intangible asset is what is driving productivity that Nirvikar admonished us to think about at the opening of this session, and driving ultimately economic growth, ultimately job creation, and we are not doing it. We are not doing that science-based asset. Even now, I mean, I'll give you a personal anecdote that will illustrate this. I founded a software company with a couple of, one IIT Delhi kid and one MIT kid about 10 years ago. And the company did well. It was in the assessment space. We grew rapidly. We had an office in Beijing, in Delhi, in San Francisco. And when we went to sell it, and then we messed it up, and then recovered, and then we went to sell it, and ultimately sold it for, I don't know, call it $100 million, something like that. But the lesson that I learned from that was that the buyer said, if you were an Israeli company, we would pay you $175, just by being an Israeli company. If you were a US company, we'd pay you $300 million. But you're an Indian company. Indian companies don't do this. The signal value is all wrong, so we can get away with paying you $100 million. And what he was really saying is that there isn't a thick market for pricing intangible assets in your backyard. So you don't really have too many options. So we have the bargaining power, so we're going to take it away from you for that, which we had to do eventually. It was right. So I think there's something to be said. There's a public good aspect to creating this. Think about that example, because I think it encapsulates pretty much everything. There's a company I'm building right now. Manish knows about it. It's in Bangalore, Chai Point, right? Which is a chain of tea stores. We have 200, 300 tea stores. It's run by my student and me, Amleek Singh. The private equity guys want to value it on number of cups of tea sold. If this were in the Bay Area, it would be valued on the tea robots that are state-of-the-art robots, right, that have enormous IP. It's India's first IoT-enabled, globally visible, like a satellite system chain on a screen. It's some of the best software that I've ever been involved with that I'm proud of. But the private equity guys here just don't have they're not wired that way. They're counting how many stores, what is the tangible output that I can value. They're not valuing the intangible IP. Right? So that infrastructure doesn't exist. That's all I'm trying to say with these anecdotes. That company is probably valued at, I don't know, 150 million, 200 million here. It would be valued at $1 billion too, somewhere else, if we had the right thick market. And so now think about the cascading effects of that. The cascading effects are that people who are building scientific companies don't want to build it here. Right? I'll give you another example. I've been building medical device companies. The first one that we built was for diabetes testing, very successful, got it through FDA approval. The world's fastest and cheapest testing of HbA1c, which is the gold standard summary if you're a diabetic and you typically have to get yourself tested for HbA1c. It's basically for the analytic-minded people in the room, it's the integral of your sugar levels over 3 months. That's all it is, right? And so we devised novel chemistry to measure this, super cheap, on your phone instantly, instead of going to a hospital and waiting 24 hours. That company was built in Bangalore with a front end in Boston. Had a huge amount of trouble selling it. Right? Had I reframed it and said this is a Boston company with a Bangalore engineering end, I would have had no trouble selling it. So my next company, which is a neurology diagnostic startup with the same technology, is now it's not going to be a Bangalore company, because I know I'll get 5x, 10x the payout in the event that we succeed just by locating it in Boston. Why would we let this talent walk away? It's nuts. And the infrastructure is all there in Bangalore. All we have to do is package it. Now, with the previous PSA, Dr. Vijay Raghavan, I tried with him. I don't know if Dr. Sood is here. He's a new principal science advisor. I'll be meeting him later today. But with the previous PSA, we tried to build these science clusters, which I described in the paper. And the idea there is just take all the science-minded institutions in each, and the professor here was part of those discussions for the Delhi cluster. We tried to create these clusters in Delhi, Bangalore, Pune, Hyderabad, somewhere else, I forget, and say, if we have this critical mass, can we take this critical mass of institutions? Just look at the number of science-based entities just in the NCR. It's amazing. But they're all autonomous, independently siloed, right? And the number of companies out here. Here's another anecdote. I had opportunity to address CII a few years ago in one of their annual, I posed this question to a room full of the great and good in India's corporate world. I said, how many of you, they're all heads of companies that you would all recognize, say 70, 80 of them. I said, how many of you have had an honest-to-goodness conversation with a scientist about your core business in the last 12 months? 70 people in the room. How many do you think raise their hand? Zero. Zero. Think about that, guys. This is India's best. Zero. I asked the same question. I ran the experiment in the Harvard class, right? In the HBS Executive Ed Forum, where you have equivalent characters from around the world. And I said, how many of you have had an honest-to-goodness, the median response over multiple classes, small samples, 7 or 8 times I did this. I would say 60%, 65% of people in the room. And this includes, by the way, people who are making cookies, dog food, plant-based protein, space, doesn't matter, toothpaste. They'll all be having conversations with scientists because there's always ways to translate this. Okay, Nirvikar's telling me I got to wrap up. I want to say, so we're not doing that, and we need to do that. Otherwise, we're trying to compete with our hands tied behind our back. It's not smart. That's my message, really. Okay, so what do we do? This is what Chintan runs, so maybe he'll have a chance to talk about it a little bit. But Atal Innovation Mission is a small attempt. I basically translated what Atal Innovation Mission is an umbrella effort within Niti Aayog, right, to provide a home to many innovation infrastructure-related efforts within India, right? And I just picked two for purposes of illustration, two of the activities that Chintan's team runs that have had more traction. Neither of them is, in my view, amazing. Both of them are amazing starts, and both of them seem to be doing productive work. One is these Atal Tinkering Labs that we're very proud of. They're essentially play areas, maker spaces in high schools. There's about 10,000 of them. My guess is 3,000 run very well. My guess is 3,000 run poorly, and the others are sort of in between. But the 3,000 that are running well are doing really amazing stuff. So these are places, unlike in my high school in Bombay and Bangalore, how we studied physics and chemistry, right? Other than doing the IIT JEE, I don't think I ever had to think to do physics and chemistry in this country. You memorize everything and you spat it out, right? But these kids are doing it differently, and they are having fun, and the teachers are having fun, and it costs almost nothing, right? Almost nothing. So there's a plan to go from 10,000 to 50,000 of these, and hopefully we can get them to work better. So that's nice. So there's a little bit of scientific mindset, long-run scientific mindset, that's being inculcated in the kids. And the second is taking a network of incubators across the country. Incubators, New Lab is a souped-up incubator, right? But the basic incubator is a place where an entrepreneur goes, has some physical infrastructure, meets other entrepreneurs, networks, mentors each other, meets some investors, etc. Useful purpose if it's run well. And Chintan's team has been upgrading the infrastructure of these incubators all over. So I did in the paper, I won't belabor it, with Chintan's help, did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And my assessment is that investment in these, it's a very crude investment, calculation that I can poke holes in quite easily, but nonetheless, the spirit of the calculation is to say that we should be calculating the returns, even if it's hard to calculate the returns of intangible assets. And if I do a very conservative estimate of the returns to just these two efforts, the tinkering labs and the incubation centers, let alone the many other things that Atal Innovation Mission does, and we net out the investment that the Indian state has put into AIM, right? It's conservatively a payback within 5 years of 10x, right? And not so conservatively a payback of 50, 60, 70x. So you put in 1,000 crores, or whatever it is, something like that, and you've gotten, I don't know, let's call the median 30 times that in just 5 years. And you've done basically nothing. You've just put a little bit of infrastructure up, right? So why are we not doing more of this? By the way, the returns to science across the US economy, roughly, right? $1 put in science results in a net present value of $17 of social surplus. That's the best estimate I've seen. It's due to Ben Jones and Larry Summers recently. For the blockbuster projects, right? Like the Human Genome Project, the returns to science are 1 to 180, 1 to 190, 1 to 220, depending on the estimates. Every dollar results in $200 of social surplus. Think about the marginal returns to societal effort, and think about the lost talent, and think about my medical device entrepreneurs who've beaten it from Bangalore and gone and said, we'll just set up shop in Boston. Why would we want to lose all this? When for peanuts, and it is peanuts, we can build the infrastructure. So that's my message, okay? That we've got all the talent, we've got all the ideas, we've got all the institutions. We literally have all the Lego building blocks. We just have to put them together and put someone accountable in charge of these things and kind of experiment our way to a better production possibilities frontier. Thank you for giving me space to suggest this to you.
Thank you so much, Tarun. So I think the point is that even though the glass is quarter full, there's 3/4 that we can fill up very quickly. So, Professor Rao, would you like to go next? 15 minutes, please.
Turn it on. It's already on. Okay, that's good. So thank you. In fact, I agree with everything that Professor Khanna has said, but my viewpoint is more, from the ground. I have been an entrepreneur. I have 2 startups. In fact, one of our startups now just launched the explosive detector, nano sniffer, based on a microsensor technology, the first in the world. We have a US and European patent, and Delhi airport just placed an order for our nano sniffer. So I think what I'm going to say is more based on my own experiences and experiences of running a large institute like IIT Delhi for 6 years. In fact, when I joined IIT Delhi, one thing that struck me was IIT Delhi has something like 23 unicorn founders. 23 alumni of IIT Delhi have created unicorns. Of course, Flipkart is, Decacorn and all that. And when we looked at what is common among all of them, these are all from BTech students, the ones who have just graduated. And secondly, all their surnames are Agarwals, Bansals, Mittals, basically these are the people. So they came from business communities, they came to IIT Delhi, got a degree, and they just created businesses. So that came very naturally to them. We also did a survey among the IIT students, and almost every second student wanted to become an entrepreneur. Every second student at IIT Delhi today wants to become an entrepreneur. And they are all competing to become the youngest billionaire kind of a tag. They are all, striving hard to get that youngest billionaire tag, and so they are very impatient. I don't think they have time to do or learn anything deeply and, do a PhD or something to understand and get a feel of a subject to start any deep tech kind of an entrepreneurship. So we thought that's not going to happen with the BTechs, at least in the near future. And so we thought, why don't we focus on more of the faculty and the PhD students? And IITs today, for example, are producing IIT Delhi, IIT Bombay. We graduate about 400 PhDs every year. And not even 1% of them are thinking of entrepreneurship. And they are not even interested in that. And they're all looking for postdocs and faculty positions and all of that. So we said, how can we change some of this mindset? The biggest challenge which I faced as an administrator was, I think a lot of research happens, but the relevance of this research is the challenge. People just imagine their problem and go to Department of Science and Technology. Most of our funding comes from Ministry of Science and Technology. So you imagine a problem in your mind, go to them, a bunch of academics review your idea, you get the project funding and you execute the project and you write a few papers. And I also did an informal survey. Almost, depending on which institute you go to, 70 to 100% of problems basically originate from library. So when a student joins, you send the student to library. Every chapter starts with literature review. You review 100 papers, you find some gaps, and you write some more papers. So that's how most of our research is currently happening. So I think what is missing is relevance of this research. And I know people in our, in IITs where they have spent with DST money modeling London air quality and proposing solutions there without bothering about air quality in Delhi, because that is how research can be done in India today. So how do you bring relevance? For relevance to happen, you need to connect with other stakeholders. You need to connect with industry, you need to connect with society, you need to connect with strategic agencies. That is what we try to do very aggressively at IIT Delhi. In fact, today, if you see at IIT Delhi, there are at least 100 faculty members working on DRDO funded problems. And now many of these are becoming technologies, and in fact you will hear more about this in the media and all of that. So from that library to library, can we create more immersion programs in our institutions so that they connect with the people, with the society, and then pick up problems from there and then provide solutions. So we launched initiatives for that. We have a initiative called GRIP, Grassroots Innovation Program, where faculty and students can pick up a local problem and then institute provides them support and all that. And we also wanted to take it forward, by encouraging faculty to become entrepreneurs. We started a scheme called FIRE, F-I-R-E, Faculty Innovation and Research Driven Entrepreneurship. We said any faculty member wanting to become an entrepreneur, we provide funding, 50 lakh rupees as a grant. We give them sabbatical. Until now, sabbatical was to go abroad and teach. So we said you can take sabbatical to start a company. And we also provided all the resources in IIT. So now I can tell you that, in some departments at IIT Delhi, every second faculty member has a startup, every second faculty member. I think to me that is something that will, make a difference. And we also started a PhD incubator and all of that. And at the national level, what Professor Tarun Khanna mentioned, the issues are plenty. I don't think, it will get resolved unless academics start managing, unless entrepreneurs start managing these initiatives rather than bureaucrats. I think the biggest challenge is subcritical funding everywhere. I think every committee has a limit and they want to remain within that limit. Things are becoming more and more bureaucratic when it comes to, the funding. And even, institutions' ability to fund innovation is also diminishing very fast. At IIT Delhi, for example, I can tell you, we did a analysis. We took all the data of last 5 years research funding. The average overhead institute received on 5 years of research funding, which amounts to something like 1,500 crores. The average overheads institute receives is 5%. And the institute spends on these projects something like 12%. So the more research institutions do, the poorer they become, the worse they become. That is a kind of a financial model you have. And you go to Stanford, Harvard, they charge overheads of 40% to 60%. In India, the overheads are 5% on an average. And as a result now, our ability to invest in anything is actually diminishing, and that is the biggest challenge. And if you also want to become multidisciplinary, start new programs, admit more students, recruit more faculty, unfortunately IIT funding again is not linked to the number of students we have. If some director becomes over enthusiastic and starts many programs, the institute again becomes poor because MHRD doesn't even, Ministry of Education doesn't look at how many students you have to give you the funding. So our funding is neither linked to the students we have, nor is it linked to the research funding we receive. So as a result now, the more research you do, the worse you become. The more students you admit, the worse you become. So therefore, it's a situation that we have gotten ourselves into. I think putting in place a proper financial model for running of our institutions is one major policy that needs to happen in this country. Until that happens, nothing will ever change in these institutions, because when did IITs on their own admit more students? Never. No IIT had ever admitted more students on their own. We admitted students when there was Mandal Commission, that was 50% increase, and we admitted 25% more students when there was economically weaker section quota. Other than that, IITs never had any motivation to scale. As a result, these institutions remained very tiny, and these institutions remained only focused on engineering. I think once we put a proper financial model, I'm sure things will change. Patenting is another big issue. I work in the nanotechnology area. When I looked at all the data of the world over, for example, in the US, which is I consider hub for innovation, for every 5 papers they write in nanotechnology, they file a patent. In India, that number is 300. For every 300 papers, we file 1 patent. I thought, can we improve that ratio? At IIT Delhi, through programs and schemes, we brought it down to one patent for every 18 publications. I think that patent to publication ratio can also link research to innovation. I think that is also something that can happen. And also this multidisciplinary research, we have all been talking about every convocation address of IIT Delhi, starting from the first convocation to the last convocation. Every chief guest talks about multidisciplinary research. But show me one scheme in this country which promotes multidisciplinary research. Is there a scheme where if 2 faculty members from 2 diverse departments come together, from 2 different institutes come together, now you can apply for this funding? There is nothing like that. In the absence of any schemes to support multidisciplinary research, nothing is going to change. At IIT Delhi, we experimented with that. We said if faculty from 2 different departments or 2 different institutes in the country come together, write a coherent proposal, addressing a societal problem, institute will give them a seed grant. And that seed grant was 5 lakhs per year for 2 years for each of the faculty members. So we essentially spend about 20 lakhs on such multidisciplinary projects, with the condition that after 2 years, you have to go out and seek extramural support, funding from other agencies. We spent about 12 crores in supporting that research at IIT Delhi in the last 4 years. The returns we got were like 180 crores. 12 crores of investment from the institute to just bring people together, and they went out and got for us 180 crores of funding. Why can't we have more such schemes in the country? I think that is what we should be actually doing. And also, research in India now is getting more and more limited to IITs and IISc. I personally feel we need to bring up the NITs and universities. And again, we need to put money where our mouth is. Can there be a scheme in the country where, you now, unless an IIT faculty member interacts with a NIT faculty member, writes a joint proposal, that funding, cannot come to them. So I think once you create such schemes to encourage faculty for Tier 1 institutes to interact with Tier 2 and Tier 3 institutes, I don't think anybody has any motivation to actually work with anybody. As a result, IITs, are struggling, but still, at least getting better, whereas the universities and other systems are degrading day by day. And I think we need to bring more schemes together so that people have a motivation to work with each other. In fact, my last proposal was to Tatas. I wrote a proposal to Tatas. I said, Tata Labs. I said, what do we need in this country? A lot of good research is happening in academia, and industries also have lots of requirements, but nobody talks to anyone in this country. In fact, the ministries have tons of problems, but no ministry has any scheme to interact with academia. Academia only, goes to Ministry of Science and Technology. And even if there is one good secretary who is willing to fund, a particular research based on a problem the ministry is facing, the secretary changes after every 2 years, and then the whole scheme will get shelved and nothing is going to happen. I think, again, the NRF is a good example. The NRF, which everybody is talking about as part of the national education policy, the ministry is coming together and funding not only the academic institutes, but also giving them the right set of problems to work on. That is what is required. My Tata Lab proposal was simple. I said, there are many agencies which are giving funds to startups now. Of course, deep tech startups still not enough money. But I said, let's give funds, but let's also provide the technical help, which is what is mostly required. Many faculty are now starting companies. They are all under peer pressure to be seen as entrepreneurs. But then, many of them don't have any idea about quality control, about manufacturing, about marketing. They have no idea. So can we create an entity which not only funds, which is providing funded advice? They provide advice, they provide technical help, but they also provide the funds. I think creating such an entity which also has facilities, so that you can do the manufacturing and all that. For my nanosniff, I struggled for 5 years to manufacture the devices because we had no facilities in the country. To create those facilities, we lost, almost like 5 years of time. I think creating these facilities, providing advice, providing technical help, and also funding, having such agencies, there are such agencies in other countries. In Taiwan, for example, there is ITRI, ITRI, and ITRI basically is a bridge between academia and industry. I think that is something that needs to happen in this country. So if we can create more such entities which act as bridges between academia and industry and orienting academic research, to solve the societal problems, either by ministry funding them or industries, through Tata Labs kind of an entity funding them. There is, huge talent in this country. In academia, I see great people with pretty good ideas, but then, they are all working on problems which are ancient, and they are all working on problems which they think are important, while the world doesn't think so. I think, a little bit of reorientation is all what is required for India to get into this deep tech space and do great things. I think I personally believe the talent is there, but more, funded national programs to promote such an activity will really help. And, I think I know Atal Innovation Mission is doing great things and all of that, but the focus currently is all on students. I think the focus needs to shift to the faculty entrepreneurship. Universities in this country have no policies. I was chairman of a committee which drafted policies on behalf of UGC for startups by faculty in universities. Nothing has happened. No university faculty can today start a company. Only in IITs you can do that. And these are the challenges. And I think if we address them, both as a bottom-up and a top-down and institutional level, I think this country, can do as well in deep tech entrepreneurship as it has done in the e-commerce and other spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rao. I think we're getting some very clear prescriptions here. Mr. Vaishnav, 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
Let's see. Just bring it closer. Can you hear me all right? Okay, well, I think, first of all, thank you, Tarun, for putting this piece together. It may make many arguments which are in the conversation, but I think having a piece like this bolsters the ability to do something about it. So I think I thank you for that. So just since I'm meeting this group for the first time, I'll say that I am not an economist. I am an engineer I started out as a straight jacket electrical computer engineer, but then became more confused and got trained in complex systems or socio-technical systems. So I think about systems that have both human and technological complexity. So that will be my perspective, and some of the, they say that breaking of a glass is good omen, so hopefully that will be that. Sorry about that. But I think this paper, it identifies several critical gaps in the innovation ecosystem, specifically science-based entrepreneurship. It doesn't really ask a research question per se, so I will not really respond to it from that perspective. But I will also take a similar perspective of thinking about the dimensions it talks about, and then insights it generates as a result, some action that can be taken as a result, and also possibly some more dimensions that we could talk about that are in our conversation here. So at the outset, I think I understand the spirit of it in calling quarter full, but I think quarter may be generous in my observation. It may be I've been thinking that it's probably a 10th full. In that, of course, there's a question of how do you measure it, right? And the point is not to measure it. Point is to say that it's less full and more empty. But the number 10th comes to mind because our innovation ecosystem today caters to broadly those who are conversant, proficient in English. That's about 11% of our population, so that's an argument for 10th. The other possible argument for 10th is that, for instance, if you look at Israel, until recently they used to say that there is one startup for every 2,000 citizens. Today we have 70,000 startups for 1.3 crore people, 1.3 billion people. That is one startup in 20,000 people. So that may be another measure of sort of a 1/10. There may be a third measure of 1/10, which is that if you think about this three-layered system that the pyramid that Tarun was showing, the infrastructure part is what we have been largely working on. Now, there's a lot more work to be done. For instance, the Atal Tinkering Labs, we may have 10,000 because nobody else did it before. We can get very excited about it. But there are 260,000 schools that are secondary and higher secondary schools. So clearly 10,000 is a very small fraction of that. So infrastructure-wise, we have more work to do. But the next layer of sort of the human resources that utilize this and processes that utilize this infrastructure, there I think we are really at the beginning. So a lot more work there. And then if you think of a third layer where specialization begins to occur, which is sector-wise innovation ecosystems. We built something called IDEX that the paper talks about for the defense ministry, we're in conversation with several other ministries to want to do a similar platform for their own sector. But that's all, again, we're at the early adopter stage when it comes to convincing ministries. I think Tarun's paper really gives us the ammunition to tell these ministries that there's real returns here, and you don't have to do a lot, as you were saying. And so I think in that sense, that's again my conception of why a third. But for me, one major challenge in writing such a piece, as well as reading it, maybe there's literature here that we can do something with, but is the following: that a lot of these advanced ecosystems like the Bay Area, Boston, etc., they're 40 years old, and so the question is, what were they like when they were 10 years old? So did they have a similar skew in favoring some sectors excessively and not other sectors? Did they have similar sort of challenges in terms of not being able, well, they probably didn't have the challenge of the academic, but the deep science challenge and so on. So I think that what they look like at 10 years is something that came to mind as I read this paper. I had a couple of very useful insights here that I didn't have before, which sort of will probably refine some of the aspects of the arguments made here. And these are also dynamic systems type of insights. First is that I realized that there's very solid argument made here about the funding ecosystem, of the availability of funding. Now, reading this, and there's also another argument made here about the low throughput of the ecosystem in terms of the incubators and so on. And that brings to mind that these two, that is the funding availability and the throughput of the ecosystem, capacity of the ecosystem and the throughput of the ecosystem, they ought to co-evolve. They can't evolve independent of each other. This is like saying that you have this city and it rains a lot all of a sudden, and you can't really neither utilize water nor drain it. If the funding suddenly increases, it seems to me that you can't utilize, and you will end up in an loss of investor confidence. On the other hand, if infrastructure increases independent of funding, then you would again have a loss of young people feeling that they came up with an idea but nothing happened to it because there were no funds. Or these young people who go somewhere else to seek funds and so on. So I think that co-evolution idea was not in my mind before this paper to this extent. So I think that is one thing that I'd like to work on also with everybody. The other idea which wasn't in my mind in this from this perspective was that the paper made an argument about this public-private research funding and the very, very low quantums that we are currently investing as a nation. And I realized that this research funding idea, it dovetails into the early stage grants and angel investment ideas for deep science type of entrepreneurship, because deep science entrepreneurship has a valley of death that is deeper and wider, and who will help overcome that valley of death? And it is really the overlap of these two, that is the greater research funding on one hand and more risk-loving early stage grants on the other hand. These two must overlap. Only then we can overcome that scientific uncertainty at an early stage. I think that hadn't occurred to me before I read this paper. The third thing that Tarun ended with, which was this multiplier over how we've invested in AIM, and now there are returns from the ATLs or Artel community, Artel innovation incubation centers and so on. This is the first time I think we are making such a back of the envelope calculation. And it has a direct impact on how we write our next cabinet note for the following reason, that it turns the idea of returns into a formula. And when it turns the idea of return into a formula, which looks like, returns from value created by startups, value created by incubators, value created by tinkering labs, and so on. And then you look at that formula from the perspective that if technology was the only non-linear, or what was the largest non-linear in the equation, then your first 5 years return cannot be the same as the second 5 years return. So it has to be some multiplier greater than 1 for the second 5 years. And where does that, what are the components that can lead to that multiplier to be that way? And I think it's very clear from this formula, and I won't belabor the formula itself, but the one thing that will lead to that multiplier is the extensive utilization of infrastructure. It should come as no surprise. But IDEX has a 50 times return because they had not to build the infrastructure. We have to do this for industry after industry after industry and say that here's the infrastructure, it's already built. Please utilize it to integrate innovation into your industry sector. So I think that argument is made very clearly here, and it will translate into our cabinet note. I want to talk about a couple of other things. One is an important area of emphasis, and second, finally end with some areas which we could include in terms of in a paper like this. I think by and large, the idea that the foundation for deep science entrepreneurship cannot come without academic strengthening academia is not adequately discussed, I feel, in the Indian conversation. I mean, so I've been here for a year since I came from MIT, and there's just a wide range of opinion about whether it should be that way or not. Obviously, the paper talks about AIM Prime, the program that we ran. The idea of that program was to take ideas from lab to the land and demystify that process to the extent that we can. So the booklet that it produced, which will be available on Amazon soon, called AIM Prime Playbook, it has all these frameworks which say that if you are stuck with X, try this. If you're stuck with Y, try this for a science-based entrepreneur. But underneath there is this idea that unless you teach your classes, I can give you vivid examples from MIT of how programming is taught at MIT, how networks are taught at MIT, because that's my domain of work, which is so transformational in terms of its inquiry. Programming is not taught by saying, why don't you go memorize a syntax and produce a code? Programming is taught by saying that here is a dabba called PDP-11 1978 computer. There are only 5 instructions, and you will have to create your own language that can be compiled, assembled, and compiled and executed. When you do that, you completely transform the person, right? This person is the one who will create the next Dropbox. This is a fact. if we don't go that deep into academia, I don't think we can have a deep science ecosystem of the kind that we desire. And I think that argument's made here, and I thank Tarun for that. The three areas where I think that we also need to talk about is, one is the manufacturing capability. I think the prototype and small trials are easy, but designing for manufacturing, very little conversation about it. And so that's something which is a major bottleneck for many startups. Second, the absorption capacity or the market creation. There are many areas where we know we need to solve problems. Water, take water for instance. Creation of market is so hard. You may innovate, but where is the market? And so this is where the government ought to step in. And then finally, human resource and skill development. We are scaling this infrastructure. Where are those managers? Where are their people are beginning to consider this as a career. We haven't provided a pathway, thought of a pathway for them that makes it real. So I think those are three areas that could be considered here. So anyway, that's me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vaishnavi. So we have half an hour for floor discussion and then a few minutes for wrap-up. So if you could, I guess the tradition here is to raise your name plaque, and some of you I know, and I can call on you, but if I can't read your name, I might just point, but when you speak, please use the mic and introduce yourself. So, Karthik, you have already... Michael, why don't you go ahead?
This is Michael Kramer, Mr. Conrad. This is maybe slightly off the point, but I'm curious about...
Is your mic on? Sorry.
Press the button, Mike. There we go.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just curious about the story about the sale value of the companies, and I'm assuming that there was some reason that just you couldn't do some legal transaction where you change the ownership of the, you change the location of the company through some internal purchase to Boston from India. That presumably wouldn't have been enough. Otherwise, you would have done that rather than leave all this money on the table. So I'm wondering, what was it that they wanted more employees based in Boston, or was it what do you think was made it that you couldn't just do this through a legal transaction?
I think since it's a specific question, why don't you go ahead? Yeah. Okay, I'll collect after this.
Can you hear me, Mike? Let me use this since it's not turning on. So it's a good point. I would prefer not to have left $100 million on the table, Michael. I think there's two answers. There's frictions in the form of taxation, right? Which is the country where you originated the enterprise is understandably reluctant to see that you say that it now belongs somewhere else, and there's all sorts of redistribution that happens with tax codes not synchronizing and the treaties not dealing with it. So that's the practical answer. The conceptual answer, I think, is that the buyers pretty much realize that they can get away with it. They have the bargaining power. There isn't really a thick market in Bangalore where we were building this company who would actually understand the value of this to give us an appropriate price. So they knew that they had the upper hand in bargaining. He was just offering this as well-intentioned counsel after the fact, saying that, had you been somewhere else? And so we took the lesson to heart. In the subsequent medical device company, it's now domiciled, right down the street from your old office in Kendall Square. And now it looks like a Boston company. Nothing's really changed, right? It's just called the Boston front with the Bangalore back end as opposed to, but I'm being facetious. There has been something changed, which is the talent has now started to think more about anchoring in Boston than anchoring in Bangalore. And the truth is that a lot of it could have been built in, Professor Rao knows this space, and many of the people in this room knows this space. There's a wonderful incubator in Bangalore called CCAM, which is funded by the Department of Biotechnology here, and it's perfectly adequate to build some of the companies that I'm talking about. But that's the answer. There's transaction frictions through taxes, and then I think there's actually, if you will, there's like a Nash bargaining game going on, and it's stacked against us from the get-go. So there's no plausible way that we come out ahead. Yeah. I think Arvind has
follow-up. Okay, please.
Why would that bargaining power distribution be dependent on the location? I mean, if there was only one buyer of something, even if you had originated in the United States, they know that there is no other buyer, so therefore I got
it's a fair point, Arvind. I think it's an empirical question. I think conceptually that sounds right to me, but I'll give you another anecdote, right? So it used to be until recently that Bay Area VCs would say, we only invest in things that we can drive to. That was a common refrain that you would hear in the Bay Area, that unless it's within driving distance, we don't want to invest in it, because it gives us the tacit know-how that we can get by frequently visiting and seeing exactly what's going on. And that seems to have been a thing that's taken to heart. I can see the conceptual argument. In practice, that's just not how it was working out for us. It is a different product, that's right. Yeah. No, fair point. Yeah.
And sorry, I had related to the same question, which is how much of this is kind of a shorthand for not just the ability to see the business, but a shorthand for where your paying customer is, right? Because in the end, the same technology in therapeutics would generate obviously much higher revenues in the US than in India. And so does being in India somehow create a shortcut for saying that their addressable market is fundamentally in India for a variety of regulatory reasons, tacit kind of understanding of local markets and stuff. So how much of that is also just caught up in the...
So that I don't think is the case, because even if that were the case, I think, so leave the medical devices more complicated, but the software was just a set of algorithms that we wrote to assess people, and that ultimately ended up being sold to a UK entity that did take it. And in fact, Amazon used our software all the time to hire engineers around the world. So it was clearly adaptable with relatively little trust. So I don't think it was the addressable market issue. I really do think that it's a bargaining power issue, the way that game actually played out in practice. But that's my ex post sense making of it.
Yeah. Weakness of the buyer market.
That's precisely what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll collect 3 questions, 2 at the back and then 1 here. And please introduce yourselves.
I'm Govinda Rao.
And turn on the mic. Yeah. Thank you.
We have excellent papers and excellent discussion. Particularly the linkage between the government, institutions, and researchers. But one of the stakeholders that was pointed out, the private sector, there hasn't been much of a discussion. Why is it that the private sector in India is not forthcoming to make investment in the areas? Is it that they still enjoy a lot of protectionism? They just want to sell off whatever exists and then don't want to really innovate? I mean, this is something which is a matter of concern, because private sector leads many of these innovations elsewhere.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Deepak Mishra from ICRIER. Great presentation, Tarun. I have 2 very quick questions. One is, I want to better understand what does the new lab, what market failure and government failure does the new lab trying to solve? You mentioned about those 5 different things, but from your perspective, what are the big issues that an economy like US, which, as people said, is the global innovation hub, where the market is not performing, that this particular lab is able to do that? In Indian context, I can see a lot of value of things that you mentioned, but in the US context, it would be good to understand that part one. But the second point is, incidentally, today we had a very, we had an op-ed article in the Times of India by one of the ministers talking about the success of the startup initiative by the government, and referring to the word, something called helping hand of the Sarkar, that how the government has actually helped to create all this important. So when you are mentioning about it, I want to understand about your quarter harp comment on the title. Is that with respect to what the India's potential is? Is that so it's a quarter of the potential, or is it a quarter of the performance, that we are actually performing at a quarter of what we should be doing? And do you see that the current environment that we have, which people seems to suggest is actually a big success? In fact, India thinks this is such a successful area that they want to make a working group in G20. India wants to propose this as part of its presidency. So I would like to hear your sense of how you see it versus how the perception is built around that. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take one more question and then yes, please.
Anoop Malani from the University of Chicago. I actually had two questions to two different panelists. The first is back to Tarun. You talked about intangible innovation, and you stressed not just scientific, but also legal and financial infrastructure. And that wasn't the topic of the commentators, and so I want to bring it back to that. And I want to know how important that is relative to the science. My worry is that if we solve the science and we don't solve the others, that'll become the rate-limiting factor. And I'm particularly biased, given where I am, on legal infrastructure and basic adjudication, which would solve a whole range of problems and not just the entrepreneur's problem. So that's question number one. It'd be great to have you talk a little bit more about that. The second one is directed towards Mr. Rao. So you talked about how you found it difficult outside of IITs to generate a startup infrastructure, a startup atmosphere. And I've heard this story repeatedly, but one of the things that would be helpful for you to comment on is the difficulties with university administration in India versus places like the United States, where there was an embrace of the startup culture across a broader range of universities, not just technical universities. And so the question is, how do we solve that problem? And will solving that problem then help you achieve your goal of expanding innovation, commercializable innovation past IITs?
So we'll have Tarun answer first and then Professor Rao. So the questions were about private sector, market failure and more generally, and then legal infrastructure. So a little bit of a common thread, perhaps.
I'm not sure I have very well formulated complete answers, and some of these are things that I would mull over also. On the private sector issue, I mean, well, that relates to the new lab infrastructure issue, right? So even in the US context, where we think the market infrastructure is a little bit better, much better, for some of this science-based entrepreneurship, I do think that there is something to be said for the common sense idea of just experience and people getting used to the idea of dealing with people of different mindsets, right? So the mindset of a researcher in a lab is very different from the mindset of an executive that has to answer to quarterly earnings reports and shareholders and things like that. And somehow thinking about bridging that gap, I think in India or in most developing countries, people have just not had the experience base to deal with it. So in a capacity as a board member of publicly traded companies, the dominant discussion always at a very practical as an institutional description, the dominant discussion is, how are we going to justify this to the analysts? That there's going to be an earnings drag. So you routinely end up in a situation where you have a publicly traded company, you've got a great insight, everybody agrees that the insight is going to result in dramatic increase in shareholder valuation, but it's going to be 5-10 years down the road. Everybody agrees that this is a good thing, and that it would be worth doing it on some sort of rudimentary NPV basis with the cost of capital factored into it. But for the interim 5 years, there'll be a drag on earnings because you have to keep investing and your annual earnings will keep going down. You can be sure in most market economies around the world that your stock price will be beaten down like crazy for 5 years. And so if you're the CEO or the management team, you're going to be out of a job in 5 years. So you're not going to take that long-term bet because the short-run institutional constraint trumps everything else. Private interest trumps the interests of the company and the interests of society in a sense. So I think that's a little bit a two-part answer, that there's just the practical aspect of how do I get to it, and the second are constraints that appear to be imposed by the current ways in which capital markets function. Simple-minded answer, not complete, but I think there's some truth in that. Sorry, was it Anoop asking? Anoop was asking a question about. Sorry, my first answer was also to the first gentleman about the private sector not being. I don't know whether you were asking about why they're not represented in this room. Maybe they should be, but you were effectively saying that the private sector is not present in the discussions about science-based entrepreneurship. And I accept that characterization. In fact, I gave you that anecdote of my speaking to the CII, where there were 0 out of 70 people who professed to have any knowledge or interest in science at all. And it was a shocking moment for me. On Anoop's question, I don't know the answer to that, Anoop. It's a little bit of a counterfactual question, which is if we were to do some of the things that I'm suggesting, which are fairly simple to do, and you could see results in, I would say, less than 3 years, would the legal infrastructure have kept pace with it? My thinking is that's not going to be a first-order constraint. But I say it as an uninformed, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not entirely immersed in, at least in India, the extent to which there is a well-established legal infrastructure, including intellectual property lawyers now, who are cognizant of systems and processes, because there's so many companies operating from here globally, and so they have to deal with IP regimes in different places, they have to deal with patenting in different places. So I would be optimistic about the legal infrastructure, at least at the level of the law firms, catching up with whatever is needed. I'm less optimistic about the albatross around our collective necks, which is the court system that's overburdened and the judiciary that's, as you know, severely overburdened in many different ways. That part, I think we'd need you to you'd need to join put your expertise to work to say something sensible about that. My hunch, though, is that that's not the immediate first-order constraint, but I'm happy to be corrected.
Professor Rao, thank you. I think the private investment part, at least my interactions with many private industries when we approach them for funding is a total lack of confidence in the academia. They think we are all theory people, nothing practical, and we also think they are doing nothing, very substantial. So there is a mutual distrust, which is a big challenge right now. And even when I approached one of these big corporates to create, an entity, something like some labs, which will act as, an innovation-driven kind of a thing. The question is, but is there something really happening in this country? I mean, is academia publishing papers ranked highly and all that? But can you show us that there is some, real value being generated out of academia? So now to convince them, I think, I'm trying to put together data and all that, but that is one of the biggest challenges I see. And another thing I also see is, the government funding in academia for the startups and all of that is all very bureaucratic. I think many a time they say, no, I will give you this much of money, but you bring half of that. So you bring half, I will bring you half. Otherwise, sometimes it's a loan kind of a thing. So wherever the deep tech startups require some higher or a substantial amount of funding, let's say when I say substantial by Indian order, it's like $1 million is considered to be a very high funding for any startup. And they say, you bring half the money and I will give you half the money. Now as a professor, where do I get that half the money? And if I was so risk-taking kind of a thing, I wouldn't even have become a professor and working for a government institute. So I think that is where the whole problem starts. But they want us to put that money and all that on the table. And another problem in Indian academia is our institutions are very homogeneous. There is no cultural diversity. You can say India is culturally very diverse and all that, but the problem is, our examination systems, the CBSE normalizes all the cultural diversity, and if anything is remaining, the JEE will do that. So finally, so finally, by the time they enter IIT, they all think alike, they all behave alike, they are exactly similar. So now, out of those people to get anything innovative is going to be pretty challenging. I always believe that to get anything innovative, you need those unlike minds to come together. People who don't think like you, people who don't behave like you, come from different cultural backgrounds. That is missing in our academic institutions. Because show me one single university in this country which is multi-disciplinary. Nothing. You want to do medicine, go to AIIMS. You want to do engineering, go to IITs. Want to do management, go to IIMs. Want to do pharmacy, go to NIPERS. I think that is what has happened now. So I think the multidisciplinary kind of a thing needs to happen. We need to bring those unlike minds on our campus I think, that requires a lot of structural changes. Unfortunately, we don't even have autonomy to do anything. Everything is decided by one ministry here. I think these are the challenges why Indian institutions aren't like the American institutions.
Could I add a thought to the private?
Absolutely.
So the private sector question that was asked, I have been speaking to enterprises, asking a question, what are the conditions under which you will invest in a startup or you will work with a startup? And the answer boils down to the following two conditions. One, when people would say that when when I can show that my top line has improved, in other words, by working with this startup, I can offer you something that I myself can't offer. That's the top line argument. The bottom line argument is, the second is the bottom line argument, which is that I have certain mandatory functions in order to perform, in order to deliver a particular product or service. If by working with a startup, I can reduce the cost of one of those functions, I will work with this startup. So clearly, and I've had this conversation with many enterprises, clearly this is an argument that has an assumption underneath that my pie is constant. Can I get a bigger slice of my pie? Because either your top line has improved, so your market share is better, or your bottom line has improved, so your profit's better. But the challenge is that in many industries, for incumbent enterprises, the pie is disappearing. So it's not a question of my slice bigger and smaller and all that. It's some other pie that's replacing this pie. So and that's where the startups are. And would you consider investing in those, or what will it take for you as an institution to extricate yourself from exploiting what it is that you do really well to exploring what it is that's new but is going to replace you, is not a conversation that's happening as much.
Thank you. So we have two, so here and then Ruchi. Yeah, please.
I'm Bornali Bhandari. I'm from NCER. I actually have been working on a specific project-based research on farmer mechanization and how to improve. Farmer mechanization is relatively low in India, and how to improve farmer mechanization and how to make India a production hub. So one of the big challenges is that India is not doing enough R&D in the particular industry. That's nothing new there. So one of the solutions was how to improve academia-industry collaboration. And when we looked at, we spoke to both private parties and the Indian Council of Agricultural Research Institutes, which are working on exactly this farmer tools. The classic problem is that the private sector is driven by private profit. They are willing to put in money, but they want whatever is produced for their own IPR. Whereas the public institutes, which actually have the research expertise, they are interested, they get some money, but they are not able to have a sustained partnership with private parties, essentially because they have to produce a public good. That's the nature of their institutes. So, and they are not able, there is interest on both sides, from both private parties and public party to partner, but they are not actually able to bring it to fruition. And one of the solutions that we suggested, which exactly came out in your paper, is the Bayh-Dole Act. I think in India we need something like that, an act which will enable public universities, which is to actually create goods, help them to partner with private parties to create goods, to create an R&D environment. The second one is that even given my US background and more knowledge in the US, it's always we always look at US for examples. Of course, it's a global innovation hub. But one of the countries which actually, one of the emerging countries which have actually done quite well and is Turkey. And they have done quite well in the academy-industry collaboration. It's another matter that when we showed the illustrations to our private party sponsor, they rejected most of them. But there are examples of how you can create step-by-step of creating technoparks, S&T clusters, as you mentioned, some of them are industrial doctorates, some of them are DST sponsored where there's exchange between the public and private parties. These are examples that one can look at. And one very minor issue but important issue is that when I was talking to a professor, faculty from ICAR Institute, they said that all the faculty are driven by patenting. They're still doing patents, but they are not doing enough commercialization of their pharma machinery because, again, there is no return for that. So essentially, they develop patents, but it is not commercialization. If you look at the ICAR annual reports, they're full of machines that the faculty is innovating, inventing, which is exactly what the small farmers need, but there's nothing in the market. They're just not able to commercialize it. And that's a specific story I just want to add to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruchi.
In the interest of time, I'll keep my question very short. Ruchi Agarwal, IMF. Question for Professor Khanna. Your colleague Josh Lerner wrote this book, The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, where he presents a counter-argument to your new lab theory, and the prominent example he gives in the book is Malaysia, where they try to create a city bio-valley, which became the valley of bio-ghosts. Now, since you've given us a big history of all the things you're doing in India, I was wondering if you've given thought to how can the effort here to scale up, the public effort to scale up entrepreneurship can make a practically more new lab and less city of the bio-ghost. Thank you, sir.
Tarun?
Sure. No, I think the first that was just an observation, so I won't respond to it. I accept the examples. Just one comment on that, though. I mean, we've been talking a little bit about patents and commercialization of patents and so on in passing. Of course, that's predicated on an underlying some sort of societal bargain of sorts, which my rudimentary understanding is that, at least in the U.S., the state will invest in public R&D, and then the outputs of those investments, intellectual outputs of those investments, are available to the public through publications, and then any citizen resident is free to use that public knowledge and innovate atop that and retain property rights on whatever is incremental, right? That's the nature of the bargain. The problem for us in India and in developing countries in general is that we don't have that publicly funded R&D out there. And it's also a problem in perhaps an equally deep sense that without that modicum of investment in basic R&D, I don't think that enough of us have the capacity to tap into the broader academic college globally on the cutting edge science issues. You need to have a minimum amount here to be able to absorb the rest of it and to be in a conversation with scientists all over the world. We have pockets of excellence, but as Professor Rao was saying, they're very tiny. The IITs haven't really scaled up, so there's a few people who can do it, but it's not nearly enough. That's just a comment. I'm also reminded, Michael's done some interesting work in the past on providing incentives for vaccines and things like that. But it just reminded me, looking at you, Michael, and then listening to the lady who was talking about the agricultural space, that there's so many other institutional mechanisms that we can put in place to get people past this so-called value of death that Chintan was talking about earlier. Right? It doesn't have to be the patenting system. It doesn't have to be the private equity. Private equity and VC is set up for just one very particular sliver of kind of innovation. Given the structure of the funds that are set up with the limited partners and the general partners, the venture capitalist has to return the money to those guys in a few short years. He's referring, I presume, I don't remember the details of the example, but the Malaysian government was very interventionist in, Khazanah Nasional and so on, or, sovereign funds that are throwing money at R&D, and by and large, I don't think they've really created anything. So it's a useful admonition to be mindful of it. I don't have any. I would say that in India, as far as R&D is concerned, we are at such a corner solution. We are at zero, right? So, and Josh is worried about excess spending by Mahathir. that's great. But I'm worried about getting off just this corner solution and getting a little bit going. So I don't think we're in the realm of worrying about Josh's problem of overreach by the state and things of that nature. It is true that there are ham-fisted interventions that might be well-intentioned by even our current state function. And Professor Rao was saying there's so many different ways that he and his colleagues in the science-based institutions here feel hamstrung by the decrepit financial model of the university, for instance, or other well-intentioned interventions that might be counterproductive. Those can and should be addressed. But I don't think Josh's problem applies here. That's a problem of excess, throwing things, getting carried away. We have the opposite problem of corner solution of zero, or close enough to zero. So.
Thank you. So Karthik, last floor question.
Yeah, just one quick question each for Tarun and Professor Rao. So I think you make a very compelling case that the ROI on these things is very high. But if government funding is bureaucratic and private funding is kind of looking for ROI in a time horizon that's not going to work out, is this then a good space for philanthropic funding, where we say, we are seeing an emergence of substantial philanthropic capital in this country, and a lot of it is still going to what I would call philanthropy 101 of building schools and hospitals and things that are visible, as opposed to these very high ROI, longer horizon kind of efforts. So it feels like taking, as the IPF, one of the IPF editors, when I think about where does one take these deliberations into the ecosystem to make things happen out of it, it feels like that may be one of the most promising areas to take something and come up with a concept around what you've just said and saying what would it take to make this happen. So just your reactions to, pitching this to philanthropy in India more seriously. And then I think a very basic question to Professor Rao, the point you mentioned about the funding formula, that it doesn't reflect either enrollment or research. I mean, this is such a basic point, right? I mean, that one would think, and see, I know the way most of education in India is funded is through, it's mostly for salaries, and it's funded in a very integer way, as opposed to looking at these variable functions. But this is the kind of thing, if you make a recommendation, presumably the bean counters in the Ministry of Finance and others would also appreciate that, because the incentives are completely aligned, right? They want the university to educate more. So why is that not happening? Because it seems so simple to fix that. Are there, why is it not happening?
Can I pile on to Karthik for a moment, Nirvikar?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Just as Karthik mentioned philanthropic funding, we can also think in terms of industry CSR funding. Indian government has actually mandated a certain percentage of CSR spending by the industries. So if we look at some of the big growth areas in India, like biometric, auto parts, pharma, if those industries were allowed to do some deep science funding in their own areas, perhaps that would be a good way of encouraging innovation.
So, sorry, yeah, please.
Yeah. Hi, my question is for Professor Rao, because you were talking about the funding constraints. I just wanted to ask, what about tapping into alumni? There's so many illustrious IIT Delhi alumni, and I think a lot of the US schools rely on donations as well. So just wanted to ask you about that.
So go ahead, Manish, please.
I just wanted a quick one for Tarun, because this location-based valuation is bothering me, right? 25% of the public markets are owned by foreigners, 50% of non-founder ownership of public markets is foreigners. But if you're a software company, pharma company, consumer company, or services company like us, you trade at a higher multiple in India than you do in the US. I mean, for Dr. Reddy's or for TCS, it's better to be listed in India than. 90% of private market venture capital funding of the $73 billion was foreigners. So the same foreigner who is saying I won't invest from driving distance is now putting 70 or 67 billion. And 50% of the M&A market is foreigners anyway, right? So unless there's some ease of doing business problem here, isn't this location-based valuation at best the soft bigotry of low expectations and at worst racism?
Yeah.
I mean.
Okay, so yeah, I think we're just warming up, but we'll also have the coffee break. So if you've been waiting to get in the last question, please just hold on. So Tarun, if you could respond to the last questions, or do you want Professor Rao to go first? Yeah, okay, Professor Rao first, and then Tarun, you can then maybe do a wrap-up responding to everybody at once.
I think the philanthropic funding, I just had a comment, whenever we started approaching, corporates for the CSR and all that, one thing which I see now happening more and more, listening more and more, is the local members of parliament have been hijacking all the CSR money. So I think that's a fact, because they say that, sir, we don't have any money, this party has taken away, that party has taken away. That is what is happening. And I always felt that, at least some percentage of CSR must be earmarked for academic institutions. And if you can mandate that 1% must go to academic institutions, it is like a forced marriage. Like in India, even in any forced marriage, we always find love. I think that is what will happen. I think we need to now do that thing in this country, otherwise nothing is going to happen. On the financial model front, I was also amazed, how can these institutions be running for 60 years without any financial model? I went and talked to many people and all that, but the problem is, I think Arvind Panigrahi is here, he knows all of that. For the Ministry of Education to put in place a financial model that takes into account students, that takes into account the research that we do and all of that, they depend on the finance ministry. Now, finance ministry needs to allow them that, if you come up with this formula, we will fund you according to this formula. And knowing how the way these interministerial collaborations happen, I think, it's just not happening. Today, any US university or any good university you take, they get endowment funds. That is what is at least 25%. And in India, we launched endowment fund. If you look at it, IIT Delhi was the first institute in 2019 to launch $1 billion endowment fund. We did it in Rashtrapati Bhavan with President of India, inaugurating that. And President of India himself gave money to his alma mater after he launched our endowment fund. So we did that. We earned in the last 3 years more money than in the last 55 years from alumni, but it is still tiny. That whole culture of giving back in this country needs to be established. It doesn't exist right now. The other one is the overheads from research projects, which is a source of income for American universities. It doesn't exist in India. Like I said, 5% is the average overhead we receive right now in this country. The third is the tuition fee, right? Tuition fee, India, it's free education. In IIT Delhi, the revenue from tuition fee is 6%. Just 6% of our money comes from tuition fee. And that is where, we cannot even rely on that. Tuition fee doesn't exist. And the other sources of income, they are all tiny fraction of the total money. So therefore, there is just no financial model. And we have talked to MHRD, said, if I have this many students, the education, it costs this much to educate a student. And, what we are charging is this much. So remaining money can come as a subsidy. You don't give us any grants. We don't need any grants. You give us whatever subsidy that is being given to student, give it as a subsidy to us, and slowly you can remove subsidies, you can do all of that. But then, it just doesn't happen because ministry cannot take those decisions. It has to happen at the PMO level, and they are too busy with too many things. I think education currently, I don't think it's happening. So I think these are some of the issues, and many things need to change. And otherwise, I don't see much of a future for IITs. I can see things are declining. Every year after year, not having in March, I do not even know what is going to be my funding for the next financial year. 1 month before, if a director doesn't know what money is going to be allotted, how do you run an institute? How do you plan anything? I think things are in a very bad shape right now.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, but maybe Chintan, if you want to take 1 minute in case there was anything you really wanted to say that didn't get a chance to say, and then Tarun, I'd like you to take a few minutes to, respond to anything you want to respond to.
I just say just one thought on the new lab idea and the subsequent conversation around it, including Josh's work. I feel, sort of having now spoken to a variety of stakeholders over the past year, that I think we can do something like a new lab. Last Bangalore Tech Summit, I interviewed Nobar Afayan, who has proposed very eloquently a very different way of thinking about how to take science-based ideas on and bring people together and so on. And I think a place like Bangalore, with its money and people, could be a place where one can seed something like this and get going. It's a different idea than the cluster idea. The cluster, but I think the new lab argument, what it points to is that we can't do it everywhere and for everybody in our entire ecosystem, but in a pocket or two, we do have the critical mass to get started on. It is my sense. So I just wanted to add that in.
Okay, it's a tall order to summarize all this. Just a comment on the philanthropy. My response to the philanthropic admonition that Karthik started with was to say something about the CSR funds, which a bunch of other people did. I'm not sure how I feel about mandating CSR funds towards whatever our pet project is. On this panel at this moment, it happens to be R&D, but we can think of many others that would be perhaps equally deserving of mandates. So I'll stay away from that. In the U.S. context, I would say the corpus of philanthropic money is, I believe, vastly greater than the corpus of private equity money. When you just look at the amount that goes through charitable foundations and do the math on it, compared to the funds flow from, which surprised me. This is a calculation that my former student Ramanananda, who is at Imperial College in London, did in one of the exercises for his work. I think it was reported in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. But that money is very large. But it requires a completely different set of intermediation mechanisms, right? So there's a lady at MIT who started a company called Prime Coalition, and it's a nonprofit. And the purpose of the nonprofit is to be a matchmaker between philanthropic organizations, family foundations, and so on, and deep tech for climate, just for climate, to address the problem which people like Bill Gates and others are trying to address with their Breakthrough Energy collaborative. Breakthrough Energy is a private sector version of Prime Coalition, which is basically saying that the venture capital private equity system is not set up to bring scientific insight to work to solve very pressing climate problems. So both Prime Coalition and Breakthrough Energy are trying to address that by creating alternative intermediation mechanisms. But one of them is explicitly directed to tapping into philanthropic capital, which had otherwise stayed away from climate investments. So there's something there. Personally, I would not hang my hat on that in India, because I think the philanthropic culture is still stuck in temples and schools, and that's great, but it's going to take a huge mindset shift. I think that's a heavier lift than getting R&D, spending as a percentage of GDP up by, 25% or something, and then using whatever we have much better than we're currently doing. I think that would get much better bang for the buck. Nirvikar, I don't really have any, blinding summary insights other than to say that, we need to invest more in science in this country. Otherwise, we are hamstrung. In effect, we're hamstringing ourselves and not solving the basic problems of economic development, as I see them anyway. And we need to, Professor Rao said it well, saying there's mutual distrust between the entrepreneurs and the scientists. And we need to think of handshake mechanisms, in effect, intermediation functions that come from practice. It's just like two human beings learning to coexist with each other. It takes a little bit of time, and you take some time to get to know each other, and you need the scientists and the industry to get to know each other. It's not harder than that. We just have to experiment our way to it. But thank you, everybody, for just brilliant conversation. Very grateful to you all.
Thank you, Tarun. So if I could just take a minute to offer my own optimistic thoughts. So I think some of the discussion was about, the institutional dysfunctions that we have, particularly in education. I think there is actually some room for hope there. When I read the new national education policy, I see some signs of, new thinking and possible flexibility down the road. And I think the discussants also pointed out some specific areas where things can be improved without any very difficult institutional innovations. But I think the final message for me was, aside from the difficult problems, there is some supremely low-hanging fruit that India can take advantage of, and that is really what I take away from Tarun's presentation. And if we don't pick that fruit, I think we have only ourselves to blame. So I think this is a really important message and a very simple one to grasp. So thank you very much, everybody, for a great start to the program. And now we can finally adjourn for tea and coffee. Thank you.